Mave was born without a wolf, a disgrace to her alpha-blooded family. Her unyielding spirit earned her beatings, her uncontrollable weakness invited disdain, and the silence within her mocked her where her wolf should have been. Destined to be sold as a bride to an elderly, cruel alpha, she was deemed worthless, a mere tool to be cast aside. Yet on the day her pack surrendered, the Lycan King arrived, his presence commanding and undeniable. King Corin, known as the Iron King, bypassed her family's prized warriors, his piercing gaze falling instead on Mave, the defiant Omega. Where others saw shame, he saw fire. Ignoring all protocol, he pointed to the girl her family had tried to erase and declared, "She is mine." The great hall of the Ashwood Pack reeked of roasted meat, stale ale, and simmering resentment, a scent Mave knew too well. She moved silently along the walls, her bare feet treading lightly on the cold flagstones. The tray in her hands, heavy with kitchers, felt familiar, but the true weight rested in the hollow void within her chest. It was a cold, aching emptiness where her wolf should have been. At the high table, her family feasted. Her father, Alpha Valerius, presided over them with forced joviality that never reached his cold eyes. Beside him sat her brother, Marcus, his broad shoulders slumped in boredom. He was everything Mave was not, alpha-blooded, strong, and the pack's future. As she approached to refill his goblet, her eyes remained downcast. Survival meant seeing nothing, saying nothing, being nothing. Suddenly, a heavy boot shot out, catching her ankle. Mave stumbled, struggling to balance the tray. The pitchers crashed to the stone floor, dark, foaming ale spreading like a stain. Marcus erupted in cruel laughter. "Clumsy filth," he sneered. "Can you do nothing right, wolfless?" The hall fell silent. Every eye turned to her. Mave's cheeks burned with shame, her grip tightening on the broken tray until her knuckles turned white. She should have stayed quiet, apologized, cleaned the mess. But the word wolfless cut deep, and Marcus had twisted the blade with deliberate force. Lifting her chin, she met his gaze. "I may be clumsy," she whispered, her voice carrying in the stillness, "but at least I don't have to trip omegas to feel strong, Marcus." The air crackled with tension. Marcus's face flushed crimson as he half rose from his chair, his hand curling into a fist. But it was their father's voice that struck like a blade, cold and sharp. "Enough." Alpha Valerius rose slowly, his power emanating not from his size, but from his overwhelming presence. He looked past Marcus, pinning Mave to the floor with his gaze. To him, she wasn't a daughter. She was a genetic flaw, a living reminder of imperfection. "You will not speak to your future alpha that way," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "You will not speak at all. Your insolence is a disease, Mave, and I am weary of it." "He tripped me," she said before she could stop herself. Her spirit burned like a pure suicidal flame, refusing to be extinguished. "It does not matter," Valerius snarled, stepping closer. "Your defiance ends tonight. You have brought shame on my name for the last time." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like talons, and dragged her from the hall. She didn't resist. She had learned long ago that fighting only made the punishment worse. He pulled her across the courtyard, sharp gravel cutting into her bare feet, and threw her against the base of the shamestone, a smooth granite pillar slick with old blood and fresh rain. "You are a burden, girl," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "A worthless, untamed creature, but no more." Mave looked up at him, bracing for the blow. "Tomorrow," her father said, his voice cold and cruel, "tomorrow you will be gone. Tomorrow your shame becomes someone else's problem." The cold from the shamestone seeped into Mave's bones, mirroring the hollowness inside her. Hours passed as the sounds of the feast faded, replaced by crickets chirping and an owl's lonely call. She remained curled at the base of the pillar, discarded. Finally, the heavy tread of her father's boots on the gravel announced his return. She flinched, expecting his strike, but it never came. Instead, he stood over her, a shadow against the moonlit sky. "Get up," he commanded, his voice flat and devoid of rage, now transactional. She rose slowly, muscles protesting. He watched her with unsettling detachment, as if evaluating livestock. "I have tolerated your existence for 18 years, Mave. Your mother's difficult birth, your wolfless state. It has all been a stain on this pack's honor, a stain on me." Mave said nothing. She had heard these words her entire life. They no longer held power to wound, leaving only the dull ache of truth. "But a leader must be resourceful," he continued, a strange triumph in his eyes. "He must find use for even the most flawed tools. I have made an arrangement, an alliance with the Blackwater Pack." Her blood ran cold. The Blackwater Pack lay a day's journey north, known for their brutality under a cruel alpha. "An alliance requires a bond," Valeria said, savoring each word, "a gesture of goodwill. They have a powerful alpha, experienced, a veteran of many border wars, and he needs a new mate." The world tilted. Mave stared at him, choking on unspoken words. He couldn't mean it. Not even he could be so cruel. "Alpha Grom," her father declared, as though announcing a prize. "He is willing to overlook your deficiency. He finds a fiery spirit appealing, he says, a challenge to be tamed." A cruel smirk twisted his lips. "You will be his bride. You will finally serve a purpose for this family. By the next full moon, you will belong to Alpha Grom." The name alone was a curse whispered in fear across the territories. An ancient wolf, decades older than her father, who had buried 3 wives. A leering, possessive brute whose mates were said to live short, miserable lives. She wasn't being married, she was being handed a death sentence. "You see," her father said, his voice dripping with cold satisfaction, "even something as broken as you can be of use. You leave tomorrow at dawn. Try not to disgrace me before then." He turned and walked away, leaving her in suffocating darkness. The name of her new owner echoed in the silent night like a condemnation. Dawn broke, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. It was the morning of her departure, the morning of her end, but the usual sounds of the pack stirring were absent. Instead, a tense, frantic energy vibrated through the very stones of the hall. Mave, locked in her small, windowless room, could feel it. The air was thick with a scent she'd never known before. Collective, unadulterated fear. Whispers slipped through the cracks in her door. A runner had arrived in the dead of night, his wolf spent from the journey. He brought news that chilled even the strongest warriors. King Corin, the Iron King, the Lycan conqueror, was coming today. His arrival was imminent. The Ashwood Pack wasn't preparing for a guest. They were preparing for a reckoning. Her impending journey to Alpha Grom was forgotten, trivial in the face of annihilation. Mave pressed her ear to the door, piecing together the panicked fragments. Corin did not negotiate. He absorbed. He was a force of nature, a pragmatist who saw weakness as an invitation to conquer. Packs that submitted were scattered to the winds. Packs that resisted were erased from memory. There was no correct response to his arrival, only survival. A horn blared from the watchtower, a single mournful note cutting through the morning mist. They were here. The bar on her door was lifted, and her mother, a woman with eyes as haunted as her own, hissed, "Get out. You will serve at the high table. Your father wants him to see all of his assets." The last word was spat like venom. Mave was shoved into the great hall. It was packed. Every member of the pack stood in rigid formation, their faces pale. The main gates groaned open, revealing the figures standing in the entryway. They were massive, clad in black leather and steel, their faces grim. But they were nothing compared to the one who stood at their center. King Corin was a giant, his sheer size and aura commanding intimidation. Yet it was his stillness that was most terrifying. He did not move with the restless energy of an alpha. He was utterly, unervingly still, as if the world moved around him while he remained untouched, untouchable. His piercing gaze, reminiscent of a brewing winter storm, swept across the hall with precision. It wasn't a casual glance, but a calculated assessment, as though he were weighing the worth of every soul present. As his eyes moved over them, an unmistakable ripple of submission coursed through the assembly. Warriors instinctively averted their gazes. Young alphas in training bowed their heads in deference. Even her father, Alpha Valerius, couldn't hold his stare, his head dipping involuntarily in a gesture of fealty. In that moment, Valerius wasn't their alpha. He was merely another wolf submitting to the undeniable presence of the apex predator. The atmosphere shifted under the weight of King Corin's arrival. A strained voice broke the silence as Valerius spoke, attempting to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. "A great and unexpected honor," he declared, his forced smile contorting into something more akin to a grimace. Mave moved like a shadow through the stillness of the hall, her steps deliberate yet unobtrusive. Her focus was singular, to become invisible. The tension in the air was suffocating, pressing against her skin like a physical force. She could sense the king's overwhelming presence even without looking directly at him. He had claimed the alpha seat at the high table without invitation, an unspoken assertion of dominance no one dared challenge. Valerius, sweat beading beneath his leather tunic, launched into a desperate display of flattery. "We are a humble pack, Your Majesty, but strong. Our warriors are loyal, our lands fertile." His sweeping gesture encompassed his children standing beside him. "My son Marcus, the future of our pack, is as formidable a wolf as you will find in these territories." Marcus puffed out his chest in an attempt to appear imposing, though the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his nerves. "And my daughter Lyra," Valerius continued, "swift, clever, and of pure alpha blood." Lyra executed a practiced curtsy, her golden hair cascading like silk around her. She offered a submissive smile, tilting her head upward toward the king. Mave reached the high table, pouring water for the king's guards with slow, measured movements. Their stony silence loomed over her, an impenetrable wall of intimidation. She felt Corin's gaze lingering, not on her, but on her father, her siblings. She avoided meeting his eyes entirely. King Corin remained silent, observing the spectacle before him with an expression of profound boredom. Picking up his goblet, his large hand dwarfing the ornate silver vessel, he took a languid sip. His gaze flicked dismissively over Marcus and Lyra, not seeing potential allies or warriors, but rather trivialities, like flaws in furniture or tools past their use. They were inconsequential, unworthy of his attention. The silence stretched unbearably, each passing second amplifying the oppressive weight in the room. Valoricius's fawning words faltered, trailing off into nothingness. Lyra's carefully crafted smile wavered. The entire pack seemed frozen, suspended in anticipation of the king's judgment. Finally, Corin set his goblet down, the soft clink of silver against wood reverberating like thunder in the tomb-like quiet. He leaned back in his chair, his storm-gray eyes drifting from Marcus to Lyra before settling on Valoricius with chilling indifference. The hall fell silent as his deep, emotionless voice echoed through the space. "Is this the best your pack has to offer, Valerius? Fawning pups who reek of fear." The king's words lingered like a heavy shroud, suffocating and unyielding. Humiliation painted itself across Alpha Valerius's face, raw and undeniable. He opened his mouth to respond, but found no words, his earlier speech dismantled with ruthless precision. The sharp tang of his fear permeated the air, sour and unmistakable. Mave moved quietly among the crowd, refilling goblets, her own terror coiled tightly in her chest. Today, above all days, she could not afford to be noticed. She drifted toward the lower benches where lesser members of the pack sat, their collective shame thick enough to touch. They had been judged and found lacking. Nearby, Finn, a young Omega servant no older than 12, approached the high table with trembling hands, carrying a fresh pitcher of wine. His wide eyes darted nervously as he navigated the tension-filled room. Marcus, Mave's brother, still simmering from the king's cutting remarks, searched for an outlet for his rage. Spotting Finn, he acted without hesitation. With a lazy flick of his boot, Marcus sent the boy sprawling. The ceramic pitcher shattered on the stone floor, spilling dark red liquid that spread like blood across the ground. A cruel laugh burst from Marcus's lips. "Useless," he sneered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Can't even walk straight." The other servants recoiled, desperate not to be associated with the incident. But Mave didn't flinch. In an instant, she was at Finn's side, helping him up and checking for injuries. Her gaze shifted between the broken shards and her brother, the fragile composure she'd maintained crumbling into nothingness. Rising slowly, her small frame radiated fury too long suppressed. Eyes blazing with defiance, she locked onto Marcus. "He's not the one who spilled it, you clumsy ox," she said, her voice slicing through the oppressive silence like breaking glass. Though not loud, her words carried weight, drawing every eye in the hall to her. Speaking out of turn was punishable. Insulting the Alpha's heir in front of a visiting monarch bordered on suicidal. A collective gasp rippled through the assembly, heads turning in unison to witness the unthinkable act. King Corin, lost in his own bored musings until now, turned his head with deliberate slowness. His movements were precise, economical. His gaze, icy, piercing, and impossibly intense, swept past the humiliated Valerius and the seething Marcus. For the first time since entering the hall, his eyes landed directly on Mave, pinning her under their weight. In the cold, stormy depths of his eyes, a flicker of something new began to burn, a spark of genuine interest. The hall was silent, so utterly still that Mave could hear the frantic pounding of her own heart, a terrified rhythm against her ribs. Her father's face was a mask of purple rage beyond words now. He moved with deliberate purpose, his hand raised not for a slap, but for a blow meant to teach her the ultimate lesson. This was it. The moment he would break her in front of the king, proving he still held control in his own hall. Mave braced herself, squeezing her eyes shut. Stop. The word wasn't shouted. It was low and guttural, vibrating with an authority that seemed to shake the very stones. It didn't ask, it commanded. Alpha Valerius froze mid-motion, his hand still raised. He looked like a statue, his fury trapped and curdling into fear. King Corin rose from his chair. He wasn't merely tall, he was a mountain of a man, his shadow swallowing the light as it fell over the high table. Gone was his earlier indifference. His storm-gray eyes fixed on Mave, alight with a predatory fire far more terrifying than apathy. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his lips, revealing the faint glint of a canine tooth. He walked past Elira, who trembled and fawned, and ignored Marcus, bristling with impotent rage. Stopping directly in front of Alpha Valerius, he forced the man to crane his neck upward. "You present your fawning pups as tribute," Corin said, his voice a soft rumble that carried through the hall. He gestured dismissively at Marcus and Lyra. "They are worthless. You offer me your strength, but I see none." His gaze shifted, moving past Valerius to settle on Mave. She stood small but defiant, her chin high despite the trembling coursing through her body. Her will remained unbroken. Corin pointed a single black-gloved finger at her. Her. Valerius stared, his mind struggling to comprehend the command. "What?" he stammered. "Her, Your Majesty?" She is a servant, a flawed, wolfless omega." Corin's eyes never left Mave as he countered. "She is the only one in this hall who doesn't reek of your pathetic fear. She is the only one with a spine of steel. She is the only thing of value you have." Turning back to Valerius, the smile vanished, replaced by the cold, pragmatic mask of a conqueror. He stated, not asked, "She is mine." The king's declaration hung in the stunned silence, sealing Mave's fate just as surely as her father's bargain with Alpha Grom had. But this was no mere transaction. This was a claiming, a conquest. Alpha Valerius's face cycled through a bizarre spectrum of emotions. Confusion, disbelief, then a profound humiliation dawning within him. To have his prized children dismissed outright was an insult, a public unraveling of everything he valued. And yet there was nothing he could do. The weight of Corin's authority pressed down on them all, unyielding and absolute. Mave stood frozen, caught between terror and awe. The air around her felt electric, charged with the enormity of what had just transpired. For years, she'd been invisible, erased even, beneath the weight of her family's expectations and disdain. Yet here she was, suddenly thrust into the center of something vast and incomprehensible. The king's words echoed in her mind. She is mine. They were possessive, domineering, but they also carried an undeniable acknowledgement of her worth, however twisted its context might be. As the reality settled over the room, Mave became acutely aware of the stares boring into her. Lyra's wide-eyed shock, Marcus's simmering resentment, her father's humiliated fury, all directed at her. But it was Corin's gaze that held her firmly in place. Those storm-gray eyes saw too much, pierced too deeply. She felt exposed, stripped bare under their intensity, yet somewhere within her, a tiny ember of defiance stirred. If this was to be her fate, she would face it head-on, with the same resilience that had carried her through years of neglect and abuse. Without another word, Corin turned and strode toward the exit, his presence commanding the space even as he departed. His guards followed silently, leaving behind a vacuum of power that threatened to collapse inward. Slowly, the tension in the hall began to dissipate, though the aftershocks of his proclamation lingered heavily. Alpha Valerius remained rooted to the spot, his face flushed with shame and anger. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and venomous. "Get out of my sight," he spat at Mave, unable to look her in the eye. Mave didn't hesitate. She turned and walked away, each step deliberate, refusing to show weakness. Though her legs threatened to buckle beneath her, she kept moving until she reached the sanctuary of her small, sparse quarters. Only then did she allow herself to sink to the floor, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Outside, the world continued spinning, oblivious to the seismic shift that had occurred within those stone walls. But for Mave, nothing would ever be the same again. To have his family's greatest shame, his wolfless daughter, claimed as the only thing of value, was not just a humiliation, but an outright indictment. It was a political execution masked as a transaction. "Your Majesty," Valerius protested, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. "Surely you jest. The girl, she is broken. She is wolfless. She is worthless, I assure you." But Mave knew these words were the worst possible defense her father could have offered. King Corin's head tilted slightly, and a look of chilling contempt settled over his sharp features. He regarded Valerius as though he were something distasteful clinging to the sole of his boot. "You wouldn't recognize value if it bit you, Valerius," the king said coldly, his tone slicing through the hall like a blade. "You've sat here surrounded by weakness for so long that you've mistaken it for strength." He didn't spare another glance at Mave. Instead, he gestured dismissively to the largest of his guards, a hulking man with a scarred face and eyes as lifeless as chips of flint. "Kale, take her." The guard moved with brutal efficiency. Before Mave could even process what was happening, his hand clamped around her upper arm like an iron manacle, lifting her off her feet. Panic, cold and piercing, finally shattered her defiant shock. "No!" she cried out, her feet scrambling for purchase against the stone floor. Marcus, seeing his sister, his property, his plaything, being taken, surged forward in a fit of rage. "You can't just take her," he bellowed, his fury momentarily overpowering his fear. Kale didn't hesitate. With his free hand, he delivered a backhanded blow to Marcus's face. The sound was wet and sickening, echoing through the hall. Marcus crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he hit the flagstones. The message was clear. They were not equals. This was no negotiation. Kale began dragging Mave toward the massive doors of the great hall. Her desperate eyes darted back, searching the faces of her family one last time. Her mother turned away, pale and trembling. Her sister, Lyra, watched with wide, jealous eyes. And her father? Her father simply stared, his mouth agape, all power stripped from him, utterly broken. They weren't her family, not really. They were merely the people who had owned her first. The heavy oak doors swung open, flooding the hall with cold morning light. Mave was dragged across the threshold, and then the doors slammed shut behind her, plunging her future into darkness. The journey was a haze of misery. She wasn't treated as a guest or even a person. She was cargo. Kale, the silent, scarred beta, had tossed her onto the back of a horse with the same care one might use when loading a sack of grain. Her wrists were bound to the saddle horn, and he mounted his own steed, taking control of her horse's reins. She was a prisoner now, led in a solemn procession of black-clad warriors. King Corin rode at the front, tall and unyielding, never once looking back. They rode hard for hours, leaving behind the damp lowlands of her home and ascending into the harsh, wind-swept peaks of the north. The air grew thin and bitterly cold, biting at her skin and seeping through her clothes. By the time they reached their destination, Mave was numb, her body a single throbbing bruise. The iron citadel loomed ahead, perched atop the jagged peak of a mountain, like some ancient predator waiting to devour its prey. It wasn't a home, it was a threat carved into the very bones of the earth. Its towering spires and impenetrable walls seemed designed not to shelter, but to intimidate, a fortress built to crush any flicker of hope within those unfortunate enough to enter. As they approached, Mave felt a suffocating dread settle over her. Whatever awaited her inside those walls, she knew it would be far worse than anything she had endured before. The fortress stood as a monolith of black basalt and dark iron, its spires clawing at the undersides of low-hanging clouds. It dominated the horizon, an imposing testament to both power and fear. No banners fluttered in the biting wind, no colors broke the monotony. Only the starkness of stone, steel, and snow greeted the eye. She was hauled through echoing halls, her feet stumbling over smooth floors that radiated cold despite their polished sheen. The air carried a sharp tang of iron, mixed with the crisp bite of high-altitude ozone. There was no stench of decay or neglect here. This place reeked of precision. Guards lined the alcoves, statuesque and vigilant, their weapons glinting faintly in the dim light. Their eyes tracked her every movement, yet their faces remained impassive, betraying neither curiosity nor pity. Discipline coursed through them like a second heartbeat. They were instruments of control, terrifying in their efficiency. Finally, Kyle shoved her into a chamber, releasing her bonds with a careless tug. Her wrists burned where the ropes had dug into her skin. He gestured toward a figure silhouetted by the flickering glow of a fire. "He will see you tonight," Kyle growled. "Do not disappoint him." With that, he turned on his heel, the heavy door slamming shut behind him with a metallic finality. Mave stood frozen in the center of the room, trembling despite herself. It was opulent, almost beautiful, but it felt more like a gilded prison than a sanctuary. A roaring fire blazed within a hearth large enough to walk into, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Furs piled high on the bed shimmered dully in the firelight, while steam curled invitingly from a bathing pool tucked away in an adjacent chamber. An older woman, her face weathered and expressionless, appeared silently beside her. In her hands, she held a gown of deep emerald silk so rich it seemed to drink in the light. "The king commands you to bathe and dress," the woman intoned flatly, her voice devoid of warmth or judgment. Mave obeyed without protest, lowering herself into the scalding water. It seared her raw skin, washing away layers of road grime and the lingering scent of ashwood smoke. As she emerged, wrapping herself in the luxurious silk, she felt out of place, like a stray dog adorned with jewels meant for royalty. Clean, yes, but still small, still afraid. She waited by the fire, her nerves stretched taut as bowstrings. When the door creaked open, she didn't turn, assuming it was the servant returning. Instead, a voice rumbled from behind her, deep and commanding. "You are clean. Good." Startled, she spun around to find King Corin filling the doorway, his massive frame blocking out everything else. Gone was his armor, replaced by simple clothing that somehow made him seem even more formidable. Firelight licked along the sharp angles of his face, turning his storm-gray eyes into molten steel. He wasn't just a king. He was something primal, something untamed. "You will come with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode away, confident she would follow. And she did, scrambling after him, her bare feet padding noiselessly against the heated stone floors. He led her deeper into the citadel, away from the private quarters and into its pulsing heart. This hall was vast, cavernous even, but unlike others she'd seen, there was no revelry here. No drunken laughter echoed off the walls. Instead, purpose crackled in the air like static. Werewolves moved through the space with predatory grace, each one bearing the marks of battles fought and won. Betas and alphas alike, they hailed from packs once wild and free, now forged into a single disciplined force under Corin's rule. As he passed, they paused, heads bowing in unison, their respect absolute. But when their eyes landed on Mave, the whispers began, soft and insidious, spreading like wildfire. Mave felt the weight of their stares, sharp and piercing, like 1,000 tiny needles pricking her skin. She was small, fragile, and without a wolf, a rarity in this world. Her scent marked her as different, an omega with no power, no protection, just humanity clinging to her like a second skin. And yet, here she was, trailing behind the Iron King, clad in silks that shimmered like liquid gold, fit for royalty she didn't belong to. She was an anomaly, an imbalance in the natural order. The female warriors watched her with disdain, their contempt clear in their narrowed eyes. The conquered alphas regarded her with cold calculation, as though she were a puzzle they couldn't solve. She didn't fit, and they resented her for it. They arrived at a smaller dining hall, elevated and intimate, its doors guarded by Kale, the scarred beta whose presence radiated tension. His gaze locked onto Mave the moment she appeared, his lip curling into a fractional sneer. "My king," he growled, his voice low and rough, pointedly ignoring her as though she were invisible. "Your counsel awaits. The situation with the red fang borders is worsening." Corin didn't falter, his stride unbroken as he replied, "They can wait." He pushed the heavy doors open with ease, revealing a large table set for only two. Across the expanse of dark, polished wood, the setting seemed almost too intimate, too deliberate. Kale stepped partially into the doorway, his disapproval thickening the air around them. "My king," he pressed, his tone low enough to avoid carrying beyond the three of them. "Is this wise? She is an Ashwood Omega, a runt. To bring her here, to elevate her, it will be seen as a vulnerability." Mave's breath hitched. Kale's words struck a nerve, naming her exactly what she feared she was: a whim, a pet, a weakness that could unravel everything. Corin stopped mid-step, turning his head slowly. His gaze was icy, freezing the very air between them. "A vulnerability, Kale?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "A distraction?" Kale's jaw tightened. "A pet," he bit out, his words laced with venom. "You took her on a whim." "Our enemies will see it as a flaw." The tension in the room was suffocating, the air crackling with unspoken challenges. Kale stood firm, a beta brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to confront his alpha. But King Corin was no ordinary alpha. He was a Lycan, his authority absolute, unyielding. His gaze remained fixed on Kale, the silence stretching until it became a weapon in itself. Finally, Corin spoke, his voice dropping to a deadly rumble. "Your counsel is noted, Kale, and it is dismissed. Leave us." Kale's jaw clenched, his body rigid with suppressed defiance. For a fleeting moment, Mave thought he might push back further, but the sheer weight of Corin's command crushed any resistance. With a stiff, formal bow, Kale cast one last glance at Mave, his eyes filled with unadulterated loathing before he turned and pulled the doors shut behind him. The silence that followed was heavier than Kale's presence had been. Servants moved like shadows, slipping through a side door to place platters of roasted meats, dark bread, and spiced wine on the table before vanishing just as quickly. Mave remained rooted to her spot, too afraid to sit, too afraid to move. Corin took his seat at the head of the table, his commanding presence filling the room. He gestured for her to sit opposite him. "Eat," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mave perched on the edge of the ornate chair, her stomach a tight knot of hunger and fear. She stared at the food before her, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Corin watched her, his gaze steady and unrelenting. He didn't touch his own plate, instead studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "You are not what he said you were," he observed, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Mave flinched, startled by the unexpected words. Mave lifted her head. What had he called her? Worthless, broken, corrupted. He leaned forward, his large hands clasped tightly on the table. He was wrong. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't understand. This wasn't the behavior of a man who'd taken in a pet. This was an interrogation. "Why did you speak up?" he demanded, voice sharp as a blade. In the hallway, she swallowed, her throat parched. She had to answer, had to tell the truth. "Finn," she whispered, barely audible. "He was scared. My brother enjoys hurting those who can't fight back," she added. "Foolish, suicidal," Corin murmured, echoing her own thoughts. "You defied your future alpha in front of his entire pack. Why?" Mave met his gaze. Her stubbornness, the curse that had haunted her since childhood, had become her only shield. "Because it's true," she said, "and I'm tired of watching bullies win just because they're stronger." The words hung in the air. A dangerous, almost imperceptible smile touched the king's lips. "Tired of bullies," he repeated, thoughtful. He leaned back, studying her now with a sharper, more calculating intensity. "My court operates on strength. Fear is merely a byproduct." He paused. "Yet you don't seem afraid of me. You should be. I am, Mave admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I've been afraid my whole life. I'm just tired of being afraid. Corin exhaled, a short, sharp sound, almost a laugh. Good, he declared, as if pronouncing a sudden verdict. Fear is for the weak. He turned his gaze fully on her. Mave of Ashwood. He leaned forward again. The fleeting amusement vanished, replaced by the cold, clinical scrutiny of a strategist. Your father, Valerius, he's a fool. Tell me why. The king's question hung between them, not a request, but a demand, an examination. Tell me why. Her fear receded, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp focus. This was no brute. This was a hunter, and he was testing her mind. My father is a fool, she said, her voice gaining strength, because he values the illusion of power more than power itself. He postures, he intimidates Omegas. He talks of pure bloodlines because his pack is weak and he has no other victories to boast about. He'd sell his own daughter before admitting she's spineless. Corin watched her, his expression unreadable, letting her words settle into the silence of the room. And his son, Marcus? He's the same, Mave said, bitterness coating her tongue. A bully. He knows only how to crush the weak. He's never been challenged. He's exactly the alpha my father deserves. For a long moment, Corin simply stared. Then, slowly, he picked up his knife, sliced a piece of meat, and began to eat. You see clearly, he stated. That's rare. He gestured toward her plate. You'll need your strength here. My court is not your father's. They are not fools. They are predators. I've locked them in one cage. They won't intimidate you. They'll try to destroy you. Mave's hand trembled as she reached for her fork. She was like a lamb surrounded by lions. The days that followed confirmed the truth of his words. Her presence beside the king was a disruption of monumental proportions. She was an omega without a wolf, a runt from a weak and recently absorbed pack. Despite this, she resided in the royal wing and dined at the king's table. To many, her position was an affront to the established hierarchy. Whispers trailed her wherever she went. As she moved through the cold, grand halls, conquered alphas and their families would pause their conversations, their eyes dissecting her every move. She could hear their muttered judgments, though they believed she couldn't. The king's new pet, they sneered. A wolfless omega, a sign of weakness. She had no allies. The servants, sensing her precarious and dangerous standing, avoided her. The warriors, especially Kale, acted as though she didn't exist. Even the other Omegas who worked in the kitchens and cleaning quarters treated her with a mix of fear and resentment. She wasn't one of them, but she also wasn't part of the elite. She was something foreign, something out of place. One evening, as she made her way back to her chambers, her path was blocked by two towering, broad-shouldered alphas from a northern pack. Their scent carried the sharpness of pine and aggression. The king's little mouse, one of them sneered, his gaze lingering on her silk dress. Tell us, what tricks does a wolfless omega use to keep the Iron King's bed warm? Mave's heart raced, but she kept her expression blank, attempting to step around them. The second alpha stepped in her way. He must be truly desperate to claim such damaged goods, he mocked. Leave me alone, she said quietly. Or what? The first alpha laughed, reaching out to grab her arm. You'll cry to your new master. His fingers were inches from her when a voice, icy and cutting, sliced through the hall. I would not do that. The alphas froze. King Corin stood at the end of the corridor, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He hadn't raised his voice, yet the threat in his tone was unmistakable. The alphas paled, bowing deeply. "My king," Ulfri stammered, "a misunderstanding." "Was it?" Corin asked softly, his steps silent as he approached them. He stopped beside Mave, his gaze fixed on the two trembling alphas. "She is under my protection. If you or any other wolf in this citadel touches her, whispers her name, or even looks at her in a way I deem disrespectful, I will not banish you. I will simply end you." He turned his gaze to Mave. "Are we clear?" The alphas nodded, bowing again before hurrying away. Corin looked down at Mave. "This is your life now," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Learn to fight or learn to die." The incident in the hall was a harsh lesson. Corin hadn't saved her. He had merely protected what he considered his property. His warning silenced the overt threats, but it only deepened the covert ones. The whispers grew colder, the glares sharper. Kale, in particular, now regarded her with open disdain. To him, she was the reason his king had been forced to reveal a vulnerability in order to defend her. Life in the citadel became a delicate balancing act. Every glance, every word carried weight. Mave knew she had to adapt, but the weight of her isolation pressed heavily on her. She spent her days observing, learning the unspoken rules of this new world. The other Omegas avoided her, fearing association with someone so controversial. Servants scurried away when she approached, unwilling to risk being seen aiding her. Even the walls seemed to close in on her, their cold stone surfaces reflecting the chill of her solitude. Yet, amidst the hostility, there were moments of quiet reflection. Mave began to notice the small details, the way the light filtered through the high windows, the faint scent of herbs in the kitchens, the rhythmic clinking of armor as warriors trained in the courtyard. These details became anchors, grounding her in a place where she otherwise felt adrift. Corin's presence loomed large over everything. He was a man of contradictions, brutal yet calculating, distant yet watchful. His protection came with a price, one she was still trying to understand. He expected something from her, though he hadn't yet voiced it. She could feel it in the way he studied her, his piercing gaze stripping away her defenses. One day, he summoned her to the training grounds. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and steel. Warriors sparred fiercely, their movements precise and deadly. Corin stood at the center, his massive frame commanding attention. When Mave arrived, he gestured for her to approach. "You are weak," he said bluntly, "but weakness can be overcome. Today, you begin your training." She blinked, startled. "Training for what?" "For survival," he replied. "In this world, strength determines worth. You lack a wolf, but that does not mean you are helpless. You will learn to fight, to defend yourself, or you will become prey." Mave hesitated, then nodded. She realized this was another test, one she couldn't afford to fail. As the days turned into weeks, she threw herself into the grueling regimen. Each strike of the wooden sword against her palms stung. Each fall to the ground left bruises. But with every session, she grew stronger, more determined. The others watched her progress with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. Some dismissed her efforts as futile. Others admired her resilience. Kale remained hostile, his contempt unwavering. But Mave no longer cared. She was carving out a place for herself, however fragile it might be. Through it all, she continued to reflect, to observe. She noticed how power dynamics shifted within the citadel, how alliances formed and dissolved. She saw the cracks beneath the surface, the vulnerabilities hidden behind displays of strength. And slowly, she began to piece together a strategy, not just for survival, but for reclaiming her sense of self-worth. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. She was no longer just a pawn in someone else's game. She was becoming a player in her own right. 2 days later, Corin summoned her. "You will come with me," he ordered, finding her in the vast, empty library. "Where?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "To my council." A wave of cold panic washed over her. "But I don't know anything about—" "I did not ask for your opinion," he cut her off impatiently. "I told you to listen. You see clearly. Now you will watch." He led her to the war chamber, a circular room dominated by a massive stone table carved with a map of the territories. His inner circle was already gathered: Kale, 3 other grim-faced alphas, and an older female wolf whose scars rivaled Kale's. They all stiffened as Mave entered behind the king. "My king," Kale said, his tone tight with disapproval, "this is a private war council." "And she is my guest," Corin replied, his tone leaving no room for further argument. He took his seat at the head of the table. "Proceed." Mave stood in the shadows behind his chair, trying to make herself as inconspicuous as possible. The council began, their discussion sharp and unrelenting. They spoke of the Red Fang Pack, a rival group on the eastern border raiding supply lines. 2 alphas, Orin and Valak, argued for an immediate, overwhelming assault. Kyle, however, advocated for a more cautious approach, fortifying the border and waiting. "They are rats, my king," Orin insisted, slamming his fist onto the map. "They prey on our supply wagons because they are too cowardly to face us. We must ride out and crush their den." Valak nodded in agreement. "My scouts report their main force is thin. They are stretched, vulnerable. Now is the time to strike before the snows deepen." Kyle shook his head firmly. "It is a trap. The Red Fangs are not fools. They are luring us out. We should secure our territory first." Mave listened intently, her mind racing. She observed the alphas closely. Orin was loud, brash, all bluster and rage. Valak, on the other hand, was quieter and more precise, agreeing with Orin's conclusion, but devoid of his fiery emotion. She watched his hands as he spoke, tracing the route of the supply lines. Yet his gaze kept flicking to another location on the map, a narrow pass far to the south. "They are weak, Kale," Valak said earnestly. "My contact within their pack confirmed it. Their alpha is sick." Corin, who had been silent until now, turned his head slightly. "Mave." The entire room froze. Kale looked as though he'd been struck. "You have been silent," Corin said. "What do you see?" Her blood ran cold. Every eye in the room was on her. I do not know these lands, my king." "I did not ask about the lands," Corin pressed, his voice deceptively calm. "I asked what you see." She had no choice but to answer. She looked at the alphas, her voice trembling as she spoke. He is lying." Kyle let out a derisive snort. "She is an Omega. What would she know of?" "Silence," Corin commanded, his piercing gaze fixed on Mave. "Explain." When he spoke, Mave began, forcing the words out. He spoke of the Red Fangs in the east, but his eyes, they kept looking south, to the fell Winter Pass. His hands were clenched, but not in anger like Alpha Orin. No, he clenched them out of fear. He wasn't commanding anyone to strike. He was pleading for it. A suffocating silence settled over the room. Valak's face had turned ashen. Corin's sharp gaze bore into him. "Your family is being held at Fellwinter Pass, isn't that right?" he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "The Red Fangs have them, and they ordered you to feed me this lie, to send my armies east so the pass would be left undefended while they seize it." Valak crumpled from his chair, falling to his knees. "My king, my mate, my pups, they swore they'd kill them." Corin stared at the broken man before shifting his attention to Mave. Without uttering a word, his eyes carried a newfound glint of Lysadect. She had perceived what his alphas, clouded by arrogance and strategy, had overlooked, the raw, unfiltered truth. In the wake of the council meeting, chaos erupted swiftly. Valak was hauled away, his destiny sealed. Kale and the other alphas now regarded Mave with a mix of reluctant admiration and thinly veiled unease. To them, she was no longer merely an accessory or tool. She was a force to be reckoned with. That night, Corin did not call her to dine with him. Instead, a servant delivered a modest tray of food to her quarters. Hours passed beneath the watchful glow of the moon, until finally her door creaked open. Corin entered quietly, not as a ruler, but as a shadow slipping into the room. His guards were absent, and he wore only a plain black tunic. He moved toward the grand arched window, gazing at the snow-draped peaks shimmering under the silver light. "You spared me significant trouble today," he began, his back still turned, "and countless lives as well. Kale's pride may sting," he continued, "but he is pragmatic enough to recognize your worth." Mave perched on the edge of her bed, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "I just noticed he was afraid," she murmured. "No," Corin corrected, pivoting to face her. "You saw what they've been conditioned to dismiss. They see strength and weakness. You see truth." He approached her, his presence filling the small chamber. Stopping mere feet away, he studied her with keen intensity. "You are unlike them. You lack a wolf's bond, yet you are far from powerless. What are you then?" His gaze softened slightly, no longer assessing her as a possession or oddity, but as a person. "Your family," he said, his tone dropping lower, almost intimate. "They punished you for your defiance, didn't they?" The question blindsided her, stealing her breath. She didn't respond. It wasn't necessary. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out, his movements cautious, as though approaching a skittish creature. His fingertips grazed a faint silvery scar on her collarbone, barely visible above the neckline of her shift. It was a relic from her brother's training dagger. Mave flinched instinctively, but his touch was unexpectedly gentle, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. His expression darkened. "Who did this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "My brother," she whispered, her throat constricting around the words. "Marcus." His thumb traced the scar again, sending a jolt coursing through her, not one of fear, but something else entirely. An unfamiliar warmth sparked within her, electric and disorienting. Their gazes locked, and for the first time, she saw something beyond cold calculation or predatory intent. What stared back at her was a deep, primal, and chilling fury. It wasn't the volatile, uncontrollable rage of her father, but something colder, sharper, more focused, and it was directed at her. "He hurt you," Corin said, his voice devoid of emotion. "They all did. They tried to extinguish this fire within you with cruelty." He stepped back, his features hardening once more, the mask of the Iron King snapping back into place. But the fissure had been visible. The control had faltered. His eyes lingered on her, a strange possessiveness glinting in their depths. "They will not harm you again," he vowed, his tone unyielding. "No one will." Without another word, he turned and strode toward the door, pausing only briefly with his hand on the latch. "Tomorrow your training begins, not with the warriors, with me." The following day, Corin bypassed the training grounds entirely, leading her instead to his private armory. The room was an arsenal, unlike any she'd ever seen, filled with weapons that seemed more like masterpieces than instruments of war. Swords, axes, and daggers lined the walls, each crafted from dark, gleaming steel that whispered of lethal precision. "You have a mind capable of cutting through anything," he remarked, trailing his fingers along the hilt of a massive broadsword. "But your body is frail. Your father starved you, left you untrained. In this place, weakness is a plague. We will eradicate it." Mave's gaze swept over the intimidating array of weapons. "I can't wield those," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I know," Corin replied simply. He moved to a smaller case lined with velvet, opening it to reveal a set of perfectly balanced daggers. Their blades were forged from the same dark steel, their hilts wrapped tightly in black leather. Each one was light, swift, and deadly. He picked one up, turning it over in his hand. "You will not fight as they do," he said, nodding toward the distant sounds of sparring echoing through the halls. "You will not meet force with force. You will counter it with speed and precision. You will become the blade in the shadows. This is how you'll endure in my court." He placed the dagger in her palm, guiding her fingers around its hilt. It felt cold, heavy, yet perfectly balanced. It felt right. "Your first lesson," he intoned, his voice low and steady. "Never allow anyone close enough to anticipate your strike." For weeks, their sessions became a grueling routine. Before dawn broke over the citadel, they trained in the armory, far from prying eyes. Corin was an unforgiving instructor, pushing her to her limits without mercy. He threw her to the ground repeatedly, disarmed her with ease, and demanded she rise every time. He taught her to kill, not just with strength, but with strategy and cunning. One morning, after a particularly punishing session, Mave collapsed onto the mat, gasping for air. Her body was a mosaic of fresh bruises, her muscles screaming in protest. Corin loomed above her, his breathing steady despite the intensity of their exchange. "Get up," he ordered. "I can't," she rasped, her voice breaking. "Weakness is not permitted," he snarled. "Get up." Summoning the last reserves of her strength, she pushed herself onto her elbows, her limbs trembling with effort. He watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he lunged. Fueled by exhaustion and a flicker of defiance, she didn't attempt to block him. Instead, she did exactly what he had taught her. She struck. Mave twisted swiftly, evading his grasp and driving the dull training dagger toward his ribs. His hand clamped around her wrist like a vice, halting the blade mere inches from its target. They stood locked together, breaths mingling, hearts pounding in unison. The air between them was charged, electric, his scent a mix of snow, iron, and raw animal intensity flooding her senses. For a moment, neither moved. She had caught him off guard, and the flicker of surprise in his eyes confirmed it. Slowly, he released her wrist and stepped back, nodding with quiet approval. "Better," he gestured to a nearby bench. "Rest." She sank onto the bench, her body trembling with exertion as he retrieved a water skin. As she drank, his gaze drifted lower, settling on her exposed back, where her sweat-dampened tunic had risen up. The scars there told stories of pain and survival, marks left by her father's whip, thick and ropey against her skin. Without hesitation, his fingers traced the worst of them. His touch was firm, but not unkind. "He did this," Corin stated, his tone devoid of question. Mave flinched, jerking her tunic down to cover herself. "It doesn't matter, it's in the past." "The past is never truly gone," Corin countered, his voice soft yet laced with danger. "It is either a weapon or a chain. You must choose to wield it as the former." Reaching for his belt, he unhooked a sheath and tossed it to her. Inside lay a dagger, the twin to the one he'd gifted her earlier. "You have a spine of steel, Mave," he said, his deep voice resonating like distant thunder. "It is time you carried steel in your hands to match it always." Before she could respond, the Citadel's great bell began to toll, a sound that sent shivers coursing through her veins. This was no ordinary summons. It signaled an alarm, a breach, or perhaps the arrival of someone significant. Moments later, Kale burst into the armory, his expression grim. "My king," he announced, his voice tight with urgency, "a delegation has arrived from the Ashwood Pack." Mave's blood turned to ice. Corin's eyes narrowed. "Valerius?" Kale shook his head, his gaze flickering briefly to Mave before returning to Corin. "No. Your brother, Marcus, and he has brought a guest." A weighted pause followed. "Alpha Grom of the Blackwater Pack. He claims you've stolen what belongs to him." The name struck Mave like a physical blow. Alpha Grom, the lecherous brute who had once loomed over her life, casting a shadow of dread and despair. Her father's cruel arrangement had sentenced her to a fate worse than death, and she had fled, leaving behind everything familiar to escape it. But now that nightmare had tracked her here. "He's here," she whispered, her grip tightening instinctively on the dagger still clutched in her hand. Corin's expression hardened into a mask of icy fury. Turning to Kale, he demanded, "Where are they?" "In the great hall, my king. They are insistent." "Stole?" Corin repeated, the word rumbling low and dangerous in his chest. His gaze shifted to Mave, taking in the terror etched across her face. The carefully controlled facade of the king cracked, revealing the possessive, primal Lycan beneath. "Prepare her," he commanded sharply. "Clean her up and bring her to the hall. She will face this." "My king?" Kale interjected hesitantly. "Is that wise? Grom is using her as provocation. Perhaps it would be better to keep her out of sight." "She is not a thing to be hidden," Corin snarled, his voice dropping to a guttural growl. "She is the reason they stand here now, and she will be the one to witness their departure." Kyle gave a curt nod and gestured for Mave to follow. She was escorted back to her chambers, her body still sore from the grueling training sessions. Servants dressed her not in the rugged leathers of combat, but in the luxurious silks befitting her new role. Their trembling hands worked to style her hair as though preparing her for battle, though the fight ahead would be fought with words and wills rather than weapons. She walked toward the great hall, a dagger concealed beneath the folds of deep emerald silk, its presence a silent reassurance against the uncertainty ahead. Kale accompanied her, his silence heavy and suffocating. As they neared the towering doors, voices spilled through, her brother's arrogant tone cutting through the air, alongside another sound, guttural and repulsive, that made her skin prickle. Kyle pushed the doors open. The hall was a sea of Corin's guards, an unyielding wall of black steel. At its center stood Marcus, the faint discoloration on his face a lingering reminder of Cale's earlier retribution. His bravado faltered under shifty, nervous eyes. Beside him loomed a figure unfamiliar yet instantly recognizable. Alpha Grom. Age had weathered him, but not weakened him. He was a twisted oak of a man, stout and gnarled, his belly heavy and his beard streaked with gray, stained by the remnants of wine. His small black eyes locked onto Mave immediately, gleaming with a wet possessiveness that turned her stomach. A slow, grotesque smile spread across his face, revealing teeth yellowed with neglect. "Ah," he rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "There she is, my little bride, finally." Maeve's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of her hidden dagger. Corin stood near the high throne, arms crossed, observing the scene with calculated detachment. Marcus stepped forward, puffing out his chest like a peacock. "King Corin," he began, his voice carrying an entitled arrogance, "we have come to rectify a grave injustice. You took what did not belong to you. This Omega was pledged to Alpha Grom as a token of alliance between our packs. You stole his property." "Property?" Corin echoed, his tone soft yet laced with danger. "Yes," Grom interjected, taking a deliberate step closer to Mave. "She belongs to me. I hold the contract signed by her father. She is my wife, and I am here to claim what is rightfully mine." He extended a gnarled hand, expectant and domineering. "Come, girl. Your tantrum ends now." The great hall of the Iron Citadel had always been vast and foreboding, but today it felt suffocating, its cold stone walls closing in as events unfolded. Despite their audacity, neither Grom nor Marcus were imprisoned. In a move that shocked even his own court, King Corin granted them guest quarters. "They are a delegation," he declared, his voice devoid of emotion. "They will be treated as such until their claim is resolved." This gesture of civility ignited a firestorm among those gathered. Grom and Marcus wasted no time capitalizing on it. Mave, cloaked in the shadows of her diminished status, observed everything. She watched as Marcus swaggered about, his false confidence masking desperation. He cornered 2 alphas from the Southern Territories, his voice low and conspiratorial. "He claims to rule by strength," Marcus sneered, casting a glance at Corin. "But he broke a sacred pact, a blood contract. What does that say about the value of his promises to you?" The alphas, their expressions stern, remained silent. Among them stood Alpha Grom, his leering gaze an oppressive weight, holding court near the fire pit. Unlike her brother, he was more calculating, speaking not of honor, but of weakness. "A fine fortress," he rasped to a group of warriors, gesturing at the iron walls corroded by time. "But its master is distracted. Matters of state, border skirmishes, all set aside for a wolfless Omega, a flawed pet. It shows a lack of focus, a softness." His words dripped with disdain. "The Iron King, it seems, has begun to rust." The whispers spread like wildfire. A wolfless pet, an oathbreaker, a king ruled by impulse? May felt the atmosphere in the citadel shift. The grudging respect she had earned was dissolving, replaced by suspicion. She had become the symbol of the king's perceived weakness. Cale's jaw remained perpetually clenched, his gaze on Corin filled with frustrated disapproval. This wasn't just about reclaiming her. Marcus was too oblivious to grasp the larger game, but Grom knew precisely what he was doing. He painted Corin as unfit to lead, someone who would steal a worthless Omega and, in doing so, reveal his own inadequacy as a ruler. The conspiracy wasn't subtle, it was a blatant campaign of slander. Every warrior who heard Grom's accusations, every conquered alpha swayed by Marcus's cries of injustice, began to doubt. Their loyalty to Corin was fragile, born of fear and pragmatism. Grom offered them an excuse to abandon it, handing them justification for rebellion. Mave realized with chilling clarity that her father and Grom hadn't sent Marcus here to win. They had sent him to lose, but to lose in a way that would paint Corin as both tyrant and fool. This was a calculated move to destabilize the entire dominion. The court was a labyrinth of shifting allegiances, and Mave alone had the freedom to navigate its tangled threads. No one noticed the king's pet as she refilled goblets or lingered in shadowy corridors. She was invisible, and invisibility afforded her ears everywhere. She needed to uncover the true objective. This went beyond mere slander. There had to be a concrete plan. That evening, she trailed Marcus. Arrogance rendered him careless, his heavy footsteps echoing toward the guest wing. He entered Grom's chambers without knocking. Mave melted into the shadows of a cold stone alcove across the hall, swallowed whole by darkness. The door was thick, but Marcus's voice carried. "Not enough," Grom growled, his tone gravelly. "The whispers are good, but we need a flashpoint." "What more do you want?" Marcus snapped, his voice laced with petulance. "We've told everyone he broke the pact. They're listening." "Listening isn't acting," Grom snarled. "We need to force his hand, make him prove he's a tyrant. Tomorrow, at the midday meal, I'll demand a formal public response in front of his entire court." "And he will refuse," Marcus said confidently. "Of course he will, you fool," Grom sneered. "And when he denies the sacred blood pact, that's when you'll rise and demand a vote of no confidence. You'll rally the other conquered alphas, reminding them of his unjust rule, his empty promises, and his illegitimate power. Alpha Ulfri and the others are ready. They've been waiting." Mave's blood turned to ice. Ulfri, the alpha who had once threatened her. This wasn't a simple uprising. It was a meticulously planned coup from within. "You'll insist he be stripped of his title," Grum continued, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "Amid the chaos, I'll seize what's rightfully mine. Your father will be rewarded for his role, and you'll have your revenge on your sister and on him." A plan, a calculated political strike aimed at Corin's authority. They weren't merely trying to undermine him. They were using his own laws against him to ignite a full-scale insurrection in the heart of his hall. Mave didn't linger to hear more. She vanished like a shadow through the cold, sprawling fortress. She knew without a doubt that she couldn't simply inform Corin. She had to show him how to triumph. Mave bypassed Cale, knowing he'd dismiss her as an over-anxious Omega. Instead, she headed straight for the King's Solar, a chamber she'd never entered before. 2 iron guards blocked her path, their spears crossing in front of her. "The king is not to be disturbed," one said flatly. "He will see me," Mave replied, her voice trembling but resolute. "Tell him it concerns Alpha Ulfrey." The name was enough. One guard disappeared inside, returning moments later with a grim expression. "He will see you." Mave stepped into the room. Corin stood before a massive stone map, the same one from the war room, his back to her. He didn't turn. The only light came from the fire, casting enormous flickering shadows across the room. "You have 5 minutes to explain why you mentioned that name," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "They're planning a coup," she blurted, her words tumbling out. "Grom and Marcus are just the faces. Ulfrey is the real danger. They're exploiting the broken pact as an excuse to spark a rebellion." She didn't just recount, she dissected. "They intend to force a public response from you tomorrow. When you refuse, Grom and Marcus will call for a vote of no confidence, appealing to the other conquered alphas. Ulfrey and his allies will back them. Their goal is to strip you of your title right here in your own hall." She moved closer, stepping into the firelight. "They want you to refuse. They want you to act like a tyrant. If you execute Grom, you validate their accusations. If you ignore him, you appear weak. They've constructed a flawless trap." Corin finally turned, his face a portrait of icy, restrained fury. He had underestimated their ambition. "And what do you propose, Mave?" he asked, his tone deceptively soft. "You, who sees so clearly." This was her moment of truth. Her mind raced, piecing everything together. "Don't resist them," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "Give them precisely what they seek. You won't appear as a tyrant if you're adhering to the law." He scowled, his brow furrowing. "Elaborate." Her mind raced now, thoughts crystallizing into a clear plan. "A full assembly," she declared. "Call the entire court, not for a feast, but for an official, public judgment. You issue the summons, not them. You dictate how this unfolds. Let them state their case in front of everyone. Let them present their sacred contract and their proof." Corin's gaze locked onto hers, his eyes sharp with a flicker of understanding igniting within them. "And then," he murmured, his tone heavy with anticipation. "And then," Mave continued, her voice low but steady, "you let me respond." A slow, fierce smile spread across the Iron King's face, pride mingling with something deeper, more profound. She had been claimed impulsively, treated like a possession, trained with ruthless precision. Yet now, bathed in the cold light of his war room, he saw her differently, not as a tool or a pet, but as an equal. "Do it," he instructed Khal, who had been silently observing from the shadows. "Summon the entire court. At dawn, they will have their judgment." The morning arrived with biting cold and piercing clarity. The grand hall had been transformed. Long banquet tables had been pushed aside, leaving an expansive open space before the towering high throne. The atmosphere was no longer one of feasting camaraderie, but rather that of a solemn arena. Every alpha, beta, and warrior of rank within the citadel filled the room, their expressions tense and uncertain. They had been called to witness a formal judgment, and the air thrummed with palpable unease. Mave lingered near the throne, concealed in shadow, just as Corin had directed. Kale stood at his other side, hand resting on the hilt of his sword, scanning the crowd with vigilant eyes. Corin sat upon the throne, an imposing figure clad in black steel, radiating silent authority. His demeanor suggested boredom, as though this spectacle were nothing more than a tiresome obligation. "Bring them in," he commanded, his voice echoing through the cavernous hall. The massive doors swung open, and Alpha Grom and Marcus entered, flanked by guards. Their initial surprise at the size of the gathering quickly dissolved into smug confidence. This was their moment, handed to them without resistance. Marcus cast a venomous glance toward Mave, his hatred evident. "Alpha Grom of the Blackwater Pack, Marcus of the Ashwood Pack," Corin's voice thundered, reverberating in the stillness. "You have come to my stronghold. You have lodged a claim. You have sown dissent in my halls. Now you will speak your grievances openly." With a sweeping gesture, he indicated the empty floor. "Proceed." It was perfect. More than they could have hoped for. Grom stepped forward, clutching the parchment aloft, sweat glistening on his skin. "King Corin," he began, his voice carrying the weight of false indignation, "I stand here as an alpha of an ancient and revered pack. I came seeking what belongs to me, only to find your hospitality lacking." Unrolling the contract, he continued, "This is a sacred blood-signed pact with the Ashwood Pack. The Omega Mave is promised to me as my bride. You took her unlawfully, violating our sacred laws. I demand her return, and I demand recompense for this affront." Marcus moved forward next, his tone laced with artificial righteousness. "King Corin, you may have taken our pack, but our blood is not yours to command. My sister was promised long before your claim existed. Your assertion holds no weight against a sacred pact made prior. The alphas gathered here understand this. They know the law. They understand honor. So tell me, how can you lead them when you disregard the very laws that unite us?" A heavy silence filled the hall. The challenge had been issued. Ulfrey, standing near the front of the crowd, watched Corin with a smug, anticipatory expression. The trap had been laid. Now they only needed him to walk into it. King Corin observed the two challengers, his face unreadable. He allowed the silence to linger, forcing every alpha present to confront the gravity of the accusation. He let the weight of the broken pact sink in, watching as Ulfrey shifted impatiently, preparing for his next move. Doubt flickered in the eyes of those in his court. Grom's lips curled into a wet, triumphant smile. He believed he had won. He thought the king was cornered. Corin leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the arms of his throne. "You have spoken of contracts," he said, his deep voice reverberating through the hall. "You have invoked honor, and you have spoken of her." His gaze moved past Grom and Kale, past the assembled alphas, and came to rest on the figure standing quietly in the shadows beside him. Mave. Her name fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Every eye turned to her. She wasn't a prisoner. She wasn't a possession. She stood at his side, equal in bearing. "You have heard their claim," Corin continued, his tone calm yet commanding, reaching every corner of the room. "You are the subject of this so-called sacred pact." He inclined his head toward her, a gesture that carried profound significance. "Speak." The single word shattered the air like an earthquake, breaking every unspoken rule of their society. An alpha, a king, had just given a wolfless omega the authority to speak in judgment. Mave stepped forward from the shadows. Her hands were free, unbound by chains. She wore fine dark wool, the dagger Corin had gifted her, visible at her hip. To anyone watching, she appeared not as a captive or servant, but as his consort. She did not glance at Grom or Marcus. Instead, she addressed the gathered alphas directly. "I have heard their claim," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "A sacred pact between Alpha Grom and my father, Alpha Valerius." Her gaze shifted to Grom, her lip curling in a sneer that mirrored his earlier arrogance. "You say I was pledged to you." "You are correct," Grom replied, his grin widening. Marcus looked increasingly confused. "I was," Mave acknowledged, her tone sharp with disdain. "Sold to you like livestock, like a broodmare traded for weapons and land. That is the honor of the Ashwood Pack." She began to pace slowly, her small frame commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "But a contract, as every alpha here knows, has terms. It requires all parties to act in good faith. You, Alpha Grom, and my father, Alpha Valerius, devised your plan, but you made one critical error." She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd. "You treated me as property. You failed to realize that I could listen." Her piercing gaze landed on Alpha Ulfri, whose face drained of color. "I stood in the halls of this citadel," Mave declared, her voice ringing out with authority. "And I heard your true intentions." Mave stood firm, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You and Marcus plotted with members of this court," she declared, her finger pointed unwaveringly at Ulfric. Before Ulfric could respond, Ulfric's roar of denial filled the chamber. "She lies," he bellowed, his face twisted in fury. But Mave's voice rose above his, unyielding. "I heard you plan to exploit this pact as an excuse to incite rebellion and strip the king of his crown. You didn't come here for me, you came for his throne." Her words struck like a thunderclap, leaving the room breathless. Grom and Marcus froze, their faces pale with terror, as the trap they had set for Corin snapped shut on them instead. Mave, the Omega without a wolf, had just unraveled their scheme, sealing their fate. The weight of her accusation, "You came here for his throne," hung heavy in the frigid air. The conspiracy was exposed, and Alpha Ulfri, his face flushed with rage, realized the game was over. With a primal roar, he lunged forward. "She lies! Traitors to me! Kill the tyrant!" Two guards at the door, the same ones Mave had noticed signaling earlier, drew their weapons and charged, not toward the throne, but toward the nearest threat. Yet Cale Ulfri, cunning and calculating, saw the true target. Bypassing the petrified Grom and Marcus, he brandished a serrated dagger and sprinted toward the high throne, aiming directly for the king. But Corin was no ordinary alpha. He was a Lycan, and his response was swift and precise. Without panic, he moved like a shadow, intercepting Ulfri's charge with terrifying speed. There was no need for him to draw a weapon. In one fluid motion, he seized Ulfri's wrist, the sound of snapping bones reverberating through the hall. A sharp, wet crack echoed as Ulfri screamed, his dagger clattering to the ground. Before the echo faded, Corin's hand was around Ulfri's throat, lifting the struggling alpha off his feet. Across the room, chaos unfolded. Cale met the two traitorous guards head-on, his blade slicing through the air like a silver storm. In two swift, lethal strikes, both guards lay dead. Amid the pandemonium, Grom watched his meticulously crafted plan crumble before his eyes. His gaze turned venomous as it landed on Mave. You, he snarled, his voice dripping with hatred. You worthless, wolfless wretch. With a surge of desperation, he lunged at her, claws outstretched, targeting her throat. Mave did not flinch. Her instincts took over. As Grom descended, she sidestepped his attack, twisting her body with practiced precision. In one seamless motion, she drew the dagger concealed at her thigh and struck upward, burying the blade deep into the vulnerable flesh of his thigh. Grom let out a strangled cry, his leg buckling beneath him as he collapsed to the floor, clutching the wound as blood seeped between his fingers. The hall fell silent, the entire confrontation lasting mere seconds. Corin released Ulfri's lifeless body, his neck clearly broken. He stood, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his sharp gaze scanning the room. Around him lay the bodies of those who had betrayed him. Kale was injured but triumphant, while Mave stood composed and resolute, her bloody dagger hanging low by her side, one foot resting near the defeated Alpha Grom, who groaned in pain. A chilling pride filled Corin's eyes as he turned to the stunned court. His voice boomed like a gavel, declaring, "This is the fate of traitors." His eyes locked onto Grom. "You will not die in my hall. Kyle, bind his wound, just enough to stop him from bleeding out on my floor." He gestured to the guards. "Throw him on his horse. He is banished. If he survives the ride to Blackwater, tell his pack their Alpha is a coward brought down by a wolfless Omega." Finally, his gaze landed on Marcus, who cowered and whimpered, paralyzed by fear. Corin sneered with disdain. "You are not worth the steel it would take to kill you. You will return to Ashwood. Tell your father, Valerius, that his pack is dissolved, his title stripped, his bloodline forfeit. He will live out his days as an Omega, cleaning the filth of the pack he failed." Corin surveyed the room, his voice dropping into a menacing vow. "I am the Iron King. What is mine, I keep, and what threatens mine is erased." The great hall was swiftly cleared with ruthless efficiency. Guards hauled away the bodies of Ulfric and the traitors. Grom, still moaning and cursing, was dragged off to face his grim destiny. Marcus, humiliated and soiled, was cast out of the citadel gates to begin his long, shameful journey back to Ashwood. The conquered alphas and betas of the court remained frozen, silent witnesses to their king's authority. The failed coup had not weakened him, it had solidified his dominance. But their gazes were not solely on Corin, they were also fixed on Mave. She stood where she had been, her bloody dagger still clutched tightly in her hand, her knuckles white. The adrenaline was ebbing, leaving behind a deep, bone-shaking tremor. She had confronted her tormentors, exposed a conspiracy, and taken a life. Kyle, his arm being tended to by a healer, approached the throne. He stopped before Corin and Mave, bowing his head in a gesture of deep respect. "The hall is secure, my king," he said, lifting his eyes briefly to Mave. "My lady." Corin nodded. "Clear the hall. Leave us." One by one, the alphas and betas exited, their fear palpable, but now mingled with a newfound awe directed at the small, wolfless woman standing beside the throne. The massive doors thundered shut, enveloping the vast hall in the quiet aftermath, broken only by the crackling of the hearths. Mave and Corin were alone. The tension of politics had dissipated, replaced by a charged energy. Corin was no longer bored. He looked at Mave, and the internal conflict, the restlessness, the craving for a challenge was gone. He hadn't claimed a pet or a subordinate. He had found his equal. He stepped toward her. She looked up at him, her bright eyes wide, her face smudged with dirt, her dress stained with blood. She was the most breathtaking sight he had ever encountered. With tenderness, his large, rough hand enveloping hers, he removed the bloody dagger from her grip. Her fingers trembled as she let it go. He didn't discard it, but slid it carefully back into the sheath on her thigh, his touch deliberate, possessive. They had seen a wolfless omega, he murmured, his voice a deep, gentle rumble. It wasn't the authoritative tone of the king, it was the raw honesty of the man. A flawed pet, a broken tool. His hand rose, his thumb wiping away a streak of grime from her cheek. The contact sent an electric jolt coursing through her, striking the emptiness within. "I saw fire," he whispered. "I saw steel, and I saw the only wolf in this dominion worthy of standing beside me." A sudden sharp connection like lightning surged between them. It was recognition, a snapping into place. The long-dormant, unspoken mate bond, once claimed by force and earned through will, roared to life. Mave gasped, her hand instinctively flying to her chest. The hollow ache where her wolf should have been was no longer empty. It was warm, full, alive. Corin's silver eyes burned with intensity, his Lycan acknowledging its mate. "They called you worthless," he growled, his voice thick with primal possession. "I call you my queen." He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. It wasn't a kiss, it was an anointing, a claiming, a vow. The bond solidified, and for the first time, Mave felt whole. The sealed bond surged through her veins, a tidal wave of warmth, power, and belonging so profound it nearly brought her to her knees. Corin's hands steadied her, gripping her arms firmly. She was no longer a fragmented, broken being. She was part of him. The fear that had shadowed her entire life dissolved, consumed by the heat of his claim. He gazed at her, truly seeing her, and she saw him, not just the Iron King, but the Lycan who had been as isolated as she was. He took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Come," he said, his voice commanding yet soft, no longer the order of a ruler, but the invitation of an equal. He led her from the blood-soaked hall, through stone corridors, past his royal solar, and to the heavy iron-bound doors of his private chambers. Pushing them open, he guided her inside. The room was fit for a warrior king, vast, austere, dominated by a massive, unadorned hearth and a bed layered with furs of black wolves and northern bears. The air carried his scent, iron, snow, and a primal musk that now felt achingly familiar, like home. He closed the door behind them, the resounding thud sealing them off from the outside world. The weight of political tension lifted, replaced by a charged silence humming with their newfound awareness. Turning to face her, his eyes blazed with a silver glow she had never witnessed before, the light of his wolf, his true self, finally unleashed. "I have ruled for countless years," he admitted, his voice heavy as if the confession pained him. "Cowards surround me, those who bow out of fear, and traitors plotting behind my back. Decades of boredom, Mave, endless, suffocating monotony." He stepped nearer, his gaze tracing her face with an intensity that felt like he was etching her into memory. "Then I saw you in that crumbling hall, a fragile figure covered in dirt, yet burning brighter than anyone else here. You defied your alpha without hesitation. In that moment, everything changed. I wasn't bored anymore. I felt alive. His touch grazed her cheek, his thumb brushing along her jawline. I claimed you impulsively, thinking you were nothing more than a fleeting prize, a shiny object to distract me. But I was wrong. I am not your captive, Mave whispered, newfound strength coursing through her veins, shared between them both. No, Corin growled, his restraint snapping at last. With one swift motion, he pulled her against him, his towering frame enveloping her smaller one. Yet, despite their size difference, she stood as his equal. You are no prisoner. You are no pet. His face buried itself in her hair, his voice rumbling possessively against her skin. You are my match, my partner, mine. His lips crashed onto hers in a fierce kiss, raw and primal, a king's demand mingled with a wolf's hunger. She met it not with submission, but with her own fiery defiance, fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. This was no agreement or compromise. It was something far deeper, a collision of iron wills and blazing passion, forging something entirely new. The iron citadel had transformed over 6 months. Once cold and oppressive, its halls now bore vibrant tapestries depicting serene landscapes alongside battle scenes. The fires burned brighter, casting warmth throughout the fortress. What once exuded dread now radiated loyalty, a fierce protectiveness binding all within its walls. Nowhere was this shift more evident than in the great hall. Corin sat upon his throne, but beside him rested another seat of equal stature carved from dark ironwood. There, Mave presided with authority. Cale approached, delivering his report with unwavering loyalty. The Red Fangs remain quiet, and the Blackwater pack has scattered since Grom's fall. Your decree regarding Ashwood territories has been carried out, my king. Turning respectfully toward Mave, he continued, My queen, the trade proposals for the southern farmlands await your review. Thank you, Cale, Mave responded, her voice steady and commanding. We will examine them tonight. A delegation entered then, led by an arrogant young alpha from a coastal pack. He strode confidently to the center of the hall, eyes locked on Corin. I address only the king, he declared, waving dismissively at Mave. My business is with the alpha. Silence fell over the room, thick and tense. Corin lounged in his throne, the weight of boredom evident in his relaxed posture. His hands rested on his stomach as he regarded the scene before him with disinterest. Then you will have no one to speak to, he remarked casually. My queen handles all initial negotiations. She has an uncanny knack for spotting liars. The alpha shifted uncomfortably, acutely aware of the murmurs rippling through the court. Corin's sharp ears caught every whispered word. He turned stiffly toward Mave, who sat poised and alert. Mave leaned forward, her piercing gaze locking onto the alpha. Her advantage was clear. She didn't need a wolf by her side to command respect. You come offering tribute, she began, her voice slicing through the hall like a blade. In exchange for our protection against the sea raiders, a fair offer at first glance. She lifted a single piece of parchment, holding it up for emphasis. But your ledgers, which you so graciously provided, tell a different tale. Your trade routes aren't being raided, they're failing. Your tribute is laughable. You aren't offering us fealty, you're offering us your debts. The alpha's face drained of color. In less than a minute, she had dismantled his entire ruse. We will not accept your debts, Mave declared, her tone final and unyielding. You will cede control of your northern port. My trade masters will take over, and we will restore your trade routes. In exchange, we will claim 60% of the profits. You will have our protection, and you will learn not to lie to us again." The Alpha, humbled and defeated, bowed deeply. "My queen," he murmured, his voice trembling. Later that night, Mave stood alone on the high battlements, gazing out over the snow-draped peaks. The air was biting and cold, but she felt only warmth. A pair of strong arms encircled her from behind, pulling her back against a familiar chest. Corin rested his chin on her head, his deep rumble resonating through her. "The court fears you, you know," he murmured, pride lacing his voice. Mave smiled, leaning into his embrace. "Good, they should." "But they respect you," Corin added. "No," he corrected, his voice dropping lower as his lips brushed against the sensitive skin behind her ear. She was no longer Mave the wolfless, the outcast, the broken one. She was Mave, the fire queen. The void inside her, the one that had once ached for a wolf, was gone. It was filled now, brimming with the strength of their bond, the power of her intellect, and the love of her mate. The Iron King had found his equal, and the Iron Citadel finally had a heart.